The planet had no sunrise. It circled its star in such a way that one side always faced the light, while the other remained locked in shadow. The human colony was not on the bright side, where heat could boil oceans, nor on the burning line where storms raged without pause. They had chosen the darker side, a land of twilight, where the horizon glowed faintly but the world itself lived in endless cold. The settlers had arrived many years earlier, carried by ships that no longer returned. Their first task had been survival. They built shelters from stone and metal, cutting deep into the frozen ground to escape the bitter winds. They wore thick layers, patched again and again until the fabric grew stiff. They hunted small, pale creatures that crawled beneath the ice, and they grew crops in sealed domes lit by faint lamps. Life was hard, but the people endured. Their children grew up knowing no other sky, only the pale shimmer of distant stars. Their elders told stories of Earth, a world filled with sunlight and seas that moved with waves. The young listened with wide eyes, unable to imagine such brightness. To them, warmth and light were dreams, things spoken of but never truly seen. The neighboring alien races watched this colony with great interest. From their view, humans were fragile creatures. They were soft, compared to the scaled, armored, or stone-skinned species that roamed the galaxy. They breathed too quickly, they needed food too often, and they seemed to stumble into danger rather than avoid it. Most believed the colony would fail. They said no people so weak could last in a land where the air cut like knives. Yet the humans stayed. For generations, they built and rebuilt their shelters, patched every hole, and mended every wall. They stored water carved from the ice and carried it on their backs through storms. They raised children in the dim light of their domes, teaching them to read and to dream of skies they had never seen. They were not strong in body compared to others, but they were strong in will. Still, the cold pressed against them every day. It seeped into every stone, into every breath. Tools broke. Crops withered. Skin cracked. When storms rolled across the land, the sky filled with frozen dust, and the colony seemed to vanish under a sheet of black. In those nights, fear pressed into their hearts. Would the roofs hold? Would the food last? Would the people survive another season? The children often asked why they had come here, to a place where the sun never rose. The elders gave many answers. Some said Earth was too crowded, and new lands were needed. Some said humans had always been wanderers, never content to stay still. Others said it was simply fate, that when the stars opened their doors, humans could not help but walk through them. Whatever the reason, they were here now, on a frozen land that wanted them gone. Among the colony, there was a quiet belief that something was missing. They had machines, yes. They had tools of metal and light. They had books and stories. But there was something more, something that belonged to humans alone, that had not yet been found here. Many did not know what it was. Some thought it was warmth, others thought it was hope. Whatever it was, the people searched for it each day without even knowing. The aliens who studied them often spoke with scorn. They watched from their distant crafts, recording human life like a tale to be told in great halls. They said, "Look at these soft beings, clinging to life where none should be. Look how they scrape at the ice like insects. Look how they fail to thrive." But not all of them mocked. A few whispered with unease. For they had seen humans before, in other places, at other times. They remembered wars where humans fought far beyond what reason should allow. They remembered explorers who crossed voids with only broken ships. They remembered voices that spoke with strange fire, a fire no other people carried. Here, on this dark world, they wondered if that same fire could appear again. The colony itself grew slowly. Houses of stone stood in rows, their walls carved thick to block the winds. At the center stood a gathering hall, where the people met to share food, stories, and strength. Outside the hall, tall metal towers rose into the twilight sky, their lights glowing faintly as beacons, reminders that they were still alive. Every day, workers dug deeper into the frozen rock, searching for minerals and water. They carried tools made dull by endless use, sharpening them again and again. They struck stone until their arms grew heavy, yet still they struck. For each strike was not just for today's work but for tomorrow's chance. In the evenings, the children gathered near the edge of the colony, staring at the far horizon where a faint band of red light touched the sky. They called it the line of fire, though no flame had ever been seen. To them, it was a promise, a place where something greater might be found. The elders warned them not to wander far. The storms could swallow a person without trace. The ground itself could split open with hidden ice. Still, the children dreamed. They drew pictures of suns they had never seen, using colors from broken machines. They spoke of warmth as if it was a living thing waiting to be found. And then came the night when one worker, striking stone in the depths, brought his hammer down and saw a flash. It was small, a spark against the metal, but in the frozen dark it burned bright. He stopped, staring. His heart quickened. Others gathered, their eyes wide. For in that moment, in that flicker of light, something ancient stirred within them. The spark was gone as quickly as it had come, but the worker could not forget it. Nor could the others. They spoke of it in hushed voices as if it were more than stone striking metal. As if it were a sign. A sign that even in endless night, something waited to be awakened. And so the first whispers of change began to move through the colony. They did not yet know what it meant, but they felt it. The endless night had given them nothing for so long. Now, at last, it had given them a spark. The spark did not vanish from their memory. Days passed, then weeks, yet people still spoke of it in quiet corners. Some treated it like a story meant to keep children awake at night, while others spoke with wonder, as if it were a sign that the land itself wished to reveal something. The worker who had seen it first returned again and again to the deep tunnel, striking stone with greater care, hoping the flash would appear once more. The colony carried on with its routine. The cold winds swept across the land, the sky stayed locked in its half-shadow, and the people worked to survive. Yet beneath the steady rhythm of their lives, curiosity grew. The elders did not stop it. Instead, they allowed the workers to keep searching, though they reminded everyone to be cautious. In the tunnels, the air was heavy and still. Torches powered by dim lamps lit the walls, casting long shadows across the frozen stone. Each hammer strike echoed through the chambers, sharp against the silence. Then one evening, the spark returned. It leaped from the rock when metal struck it, glowing bright for a moment before fading. The workers gasped, and one reached out a hand, though the light was gone before fingers could touch it. This time, they did not dismiss it. They collected pieces of the strange stone, carrying it carefully back to the surface. The colony gathered around the discovery. Men, women, and children leaned close as the worker struck two pieces together, and again a spark flew out. It was small and brief, but to the people, it was more than light. It was warmth, even if only for an instant. The children clapped in delight, their eyes shining as though they had just witnessed magic. The elders exchanged careful looks. Some were cautious, worried the sparks carried hidden danger. Others whispered that this was a gift waiting to be understood. That night, the spark became the talk of every home. Families sat in their shelters, speaking of what it might mean. Some said it could help against the storms. Some dreamed of heat for their frozen homes. Others wondered if it was dangerous, a secret the land had kept hidden for good reason. Curiosity, however, was stronger than fear. The next day, the workers tested the spark again. They struck the stones together, watching as sparks leapt into the air. At first, they only glowed and faded, harmless and fleeting. But then one spark landed on a strip of old cloth, and for the first time, they saw it. A tiny flame flickered, golden and alive, curling upward. The people gasped. The flame moved as though it breathed, growing and shrinking in rhythm. It was unlike any light they had known. It danced, it warmed, and it cast shadows that seemed to live on the walls. Panic came first. Someone cried out, rushing to smother the flame with their boot. The light vanished, leaving behind a faint trail of smoke. Fear swept through the crowd. They spoke of danger, of fire spreading uncontrolled, of shelters turning to ash. They had worked too hard to let their colony be undone by a new risk. Yet even in fear, their eyes returned to the place where the flame had been. They had seen its glow. They had felt its warmth. For the first time in endless memory, the cold had lifted, even for a heartbeat. The elders met that evening in the gathering hall. The walls were thick, the room heavy with the weight of their voices. They spoke of what the spark could mean. Some argued it should be forbidden, locked away and never touched again. Others believed it might be the very key they had been searching for, the missing piece of their lives in this endless night. One elder, a woman who had lived through more storms than most, spoke with quiet strength. She reminded them of their history, of how humans had always been wanderers, seekers, and builders. She said that if the land gave them something, they must learn its use rather than fear it. Her words carried weight, and many nodded in agreement. At last, they decided the spark would not be forgotten. It would be studied with care, but never ignored. So began the first experiments. The workers returned to the tunnels, collecting more of the strange stone that birthed the sparks. They carried it back to the colony and tested it under watchful eyes. With patience, they learned that sparks could grow into flame if they touched dry cloth, wood, or fibers from the frozen plants they had once thought useless. They built small fires in the open air, never within the shelters, and kept buckets of water near at all times. At first, the flames frightened them. They leapt high, hungry, and wild, as though alive with its own will. The people stood back, shields ready, fearing it might spread. But as they watched, they also saw how it pushed back the cold. When they held out their hands, they felt warmth seep into their skin. Their breath no longer turned to frost in the air. For the first time in their lives, the people knew what true heat felt like. The children laughed and danced near the fire, though kept at a safe distance. The elders, once cautious, sat close enough to feel the glow upon their faces. The workers who had first struck the stones stood in pride, for they had brought something new into the colony. The aliens who observed them from distant skies took notice as well. They had long watched the humans with detached curiosity, but now they leaned closer to their screens. They knew fire. To them, it was old and forgotten, something their people had abandoned long ago when machines replaced simple flame. Yet seeing the humans discover it again filled them with strange unease. They spoke among themselves, asking why humans would dare to wield such a thing. They feared that these fragile beings, who should have broken long ago, might now rise stronger than before. Fire was not just heat. It was transformation. Back in the colony, fire became both gift and challenge. The people tested its strength, placing stones near it to see how they changed, cooking food over it to taste the difference, warming their shelters with small, controlled flames. Each experiment carried risk, but with each success, their confidence grew. One evening, when the storm winds howled loudest and the cold pressed hardest, the people gathered around a fire that blazed brighter than any lamp. They sat in silence, watching its light move across their faces. For the first time in memory, they did not shiver in fear of the night. The spark had given them more than warmth. It had given them hope. And though they did not yet know it, this discovery would become the first step in a battle greater than any they had faced before. The endless night had challenged them for generations, but now, for the first time, they had found a weapon strong enough to fight back. The fire had changed everything. In the frozen land of endless twilight, where the cold always pressed against their bones, the warmth of the flame felt like a miracle. People gathered near it during the long nights, watching its golden light dance on the walls of stone. Children laughed at the shadows it made, while elders stretched their tired hands toward the glow. For a time, hope spread through the colony. But with hope came fear. The flame was alive in a way no one could explain. It moved with a will of its own, swaying, twisting, and leaping. It grew if fed, shrank if starved, and vanished if smothered. No tool, no machine, no creature they had ever known behaved like this. Some whispered that it was a spirit born of the land, too wild to be tamed. Others said it was dangerous, a test meant to punish the careless. One evening, while a small fire was being watched in the open square, a gust of wind swept across the colony. Sparks flew upward, landing on dry cloth. In an instant, the fabric burst into flame. The people cried out in alarm. They rushed with buckets of water, stamping with boots and throwing snow until the fire was smothered. Smoke rose into the air, dark and choking. The crowd stood in silence after the danger passed. The children no longer laughed. The elders looked uneasy. What had seemed like a gift now appeared like a threat. They realized that fire could protect, but it could also destroy. It gave life, but it could also take it away if left uncontrolled. The elders called another gathering in the great hall. The people filled the room, their voices low and troubled. Some argued that fire should be banned, that no one should strike the stones again. They reminded the colony of their shelters built from wood and cloth, of stores of food carefully saved for the long winter months. One careless flame could take everything from them. Others spoke in defense of fire. They said it had already saved lives by warming the weak and giving strength during storms. They believed it was not the flame itself that was dangerous, but how it was used. If they learned discipline, they could master it. The debate grew louder as the night went on. Fear pressed against hope, and neither side would yield. At last, the elder woman who had once spoken in favor of studying the fire raised her hand. The hall grew silent. She said that humans had always faced danger, not by avoiding it but by learning from it. The flame was no different. It could burn them, yes, but it could also carry them forward. Her words settled the matter, though unease remained. The colony would continue to study fire, but strict rules were placed. No flame would burn inside the homes. Fires would be lit only under the open sky, always with water nearby. A group of watchers would be chosen each time to guard against accidents. Even with rules, fear lingered. Mothers pulled their children back from the fire's glow. Workers struck the stones with hesitation, glancing around as though expecting disaster. The fire itself seemed to sense their doubt, crackling with sharp bursts that startled the timid. Yet despite their fears, the flame grew in importance. On stormy nights when the winds howled like voices in the dark, the people lit fires and gathered close. The warmth gave them courage to face the storm. When sickness struck, fire boiled water for healing herbs. When food ran low, fire cooked meat that once had to be eaten raw. Slowly, even those who doubted began to see that their survival was tied to this strange, living light. The aliens who watched from orbit saw all of this with great interest. In their halls, they argued as fiercely as the humans below. Some laughed, saying the fragile species would destroy themselves with their new discovery. Others felt unease growing in their hearts. They remembered their own histories, old stories carved into stone, when their ancestors too had once discovered fire. They had moved beyond it, replacing it with machines and endless energy, but they could not forget what it had meant. Fire was not only survival. It was the first step toward transformation. Back on the ground, fear of the flame did not fade completely. It lived in the minds of the people even as they grew skilled in using it. There was always the memory of how quickly it could leap, how easily it could consume. But this fear was not entirely weakness. It made them careful. It taught them respect. One evening, As the colony gathered around the largest fire they had ever lit, the elder woman spoke again. She told the people that fire was like the cold itself. Both were dangerous. Both could take lives. Yet both could also teach strength. The difference was choice. The cold belonged to the world. The fire now belonged to them. Her words reached the hearts of the people. They understood that the flame was not an enemy to be destroyed nor a toy to be played with. It was a force to be honored, a tool that demanded wisdom. The children listened with wide eyes, the workers with thoughtful silence, and even the most cautious elders nodded. From that day, the colony's fear of fire remained, but it was no longer the fear of helplessness. It became the fear that sharpened their discipline, the respect that shaped their care. They learned to build fire pits from stone so the flames would not spread. They learned to feed the flames with measured hands, never too much, never too little. They learned to watch it together, so no one person bore the burden alone. The fire no longer belonged to a single worker who struck the stones. It belonged to all of them. And as the flames rose higher each night, glowing against the endless dark sky, the colony began to change. They were no longer only survivors clinging to life in a frozen world. They were people with a new power, a light of their own making. Still, the fear of flame whispered in their hearts. But instead of holding them back, it pushed them forward. For they understood a truth now written in their lives. Fear was not only something to run from. Fear could be a teacher. And through fire, they would learn. The colony had grown used to fire. Each day they grew braver, lighting flames in stone pits and guarding them with care. The warmth changed their lives. It gave strength during storms, boiled water for drinking, and cooked food that once froze in their hands. The flame was no longer only a spark. It had become part of the colony, a trusted companion. But the world they lived on was harsh and unyielding. It did not rest, nor did it allow them comfort for long. The cold was not their only enemy. Storms, black and fierce, rolled across the frozen plains without warning. Winds carried dust sharp as blades, cutting skin and tearing cloth. The people had survived many storms before, but none had struck after the discovery of fire. One evening, the sky began to change. A low sound filled the air, deep and heavy, like the growl of a distant beast. The horizon darkened, the faint red glow of twilight swallowed by rising clouds. The elders looked to the sky with grim faces. They knew what was coming. A storm unlike any they had seen before. The colony hurried to prepare. Walls were reinforced, food and water were carried into storage, and children were brought into the deepest shelters. Still, fear filled their hearts. The storm was larger than any in memory. Its winds howled across the plain before it even reached them. Dust swept into the air, turning the sky black. When the storm struck, it came with fury. The winds roared, shaking walls until stones trembled. Dust and snow pounded the colony, blocking every path. People huddled in their homes, holding one another close, listening to the endless roar. For hours, they believed their walls would not hold. Then, when the cold grew sharpest and the storm strongest, the fires they had built outside began to fade. The watchers had tried to shield them, covering the pits with stone and standing guard with wet cloths, but the storm was too powerful. The wind stole the warmth, scattering sparks into the dark. Flames that had once roared proudly sank into smoke and ash. One by one, the fires died. Inside the shelters, the people felt the cold return, pressing against their skin like knives. Children began to cry, their breath white in the air. Elders shook with weakness, their hands stiff. Fear swept through the colony. Without fire, they were defenseless against the storm. The workers who had first brought the spark stepped forward. They refused to surrender. They gathered what stones they had saved, striking them again and again, even as the wind stole each new spark. Their arms grew weary, their faces stung with dust, but they did not stop. They struck harder, faster, desperate to bring life to the flame again. At last, a spark caught. It landed on a piece of dry cloth, glowing faintly. The workers shielded it with their hands, protecting it from the storm. The tiny flame struggled, bending beneath the wind, but it did not die. They fed it with care, adding fibers, then wood, until the flame grew strong enough to resist. The people saw the glow and gathered around. Their fear turned to courage. More workers joined, lighting more fires, building them stronger, surrounding them with stone walls to block the wind. The storm howled, but the flames stood against it. Golden light cut through the darkness, pushing back the shadow of the storm. It was not only warmth that returned to them. It was hope. The storm raged for hours without pause. Many shelters shook, and some roofs collapsed. Families rushed out into the dark, carrying children, guiding elders, running for safety. They moved toward the flames, toward the light. The fires became more than protection. They became beacons. All night the people fought, not only against the storm but also against their own fear. The wind tore at their clothes, snow blinded their eyes, dust filled their lungs. Yet they did not stop. They carried fire from one pit to another, spreading its strength through the colony. They built new walls of stone and snow, holding back the storm with their own hands. The fire gave them courage they had never known before. With it, they stood tall against the fury of the world. Without it, they would have been lost. At last, when the sky began to clear and the storm weakened, the people looked around their colony. Many homes were damaged. Supplies had been lost. But they still stood. They had survived. And at the heart of the colony, fires still burned, golden and alive. The people gathered around the largest fire, their faces marked with dust and weariness. Children clung to their parents, elders leaned on younger arms, and workers stood with pride. They had fought their first true battle with fire, not against it but with it as their ally. Together, they had faced the storm and endured. That night, the colony changed. Fire was no longer seen as only dangerous or strange. It was their weapon, their shield, their hope. It was something that made them stronger than the cold, stronger than the storm. The people who once feared the flame now honored it. In the halls of distant alien ships, watchers spoke with uneasy voices. They had seen the storm strike, had expected to witness the end of the fragile humans. Instead, they saw fire blazing bright in the heart of the colony. They saw a people who refused to yield, who carried sparks in their hands like soldiers carrying blades. The aliens whispered among themselves. Fire was old, yes, but it was powerful. To see humans wield it again, to see them fight not with machines but with will, filled the observers with doubt. Perhaps the fragile species was not as weak as they believed. Perhaps something within them burned stronger than any storm. Back on the frozen world, the humans knew only this: the night would always bring storms, the cold would always return, and fear would never fully vanish. But now they had a light of their own. A spark that could fight back the darkness. The people of the colony stood around the fire, lifting their hands to its glow. They were weary, but they were unbroken. The endless night had tested them, and with fire they had answered. This was their first battle, and it would not be their last. The storm passed, but the memory of it lingered in every heart. The colony stood in silence as dawnless skies cleared and winds weakened. The land was scarred, shelters damaged, supplies lost. Yet amid the ruins, fires still burned. They glowed like golden hearts in the middle of the frozen world, steady and alive. For the first time in their long struggle, the people did not see themselves as victims of the land. They saw themselves as survivors who had fought and endured. They had not only faced the storm, they had pushed it back with their own hands, with their own fire. This feeling spread like warmth itself, filling the colony with strength that had not existed before. Families who had huddled in fear only days earlier now spoke of courage. Workers who had swung hammers until their arms ached stood taller. Children who once played in shadows now ran in circles around the flames, shouting and laughing. The flame was no longer strange, no longer feared. It had become part of who they were. The elders noticed this change most of all. In meetings, they spoke of how fire had done more than give warmth. It had given unity. In the storm, no family had stood alone. Every hand had worked together to keep the flames alive. Every person had guarded the colony as one. Fire had not divided them. It had bound them together. The people began to weave fire into every part of life. They built larger fire pits in the center of the colony, lined with stone to hold the flames steady. They crafted tools to carry fire from one place to another without losing its strength. They cooked food more often, discovering new flavors in meat and plants. Even simple meals became moments of joy as families gathered around glowing flames, sharing warmth with one another. The children grew up seeing fire as something natural. They learned how to strike sparks from the stones, how to build small flames with care, and how to keep them safe. To them, fire was not dangerous but powerful, something to be respected. It was a lesson every child carried, passed from the hands of their parents to their own. The cold no longer held the same power it once did. Yes, it still bit at their skin and froze the land, but it no longer ruled their lives. With fire, the people could push it back, even if only in small circles of light. They no longer feared that every storm would bring their end. Now, they believed they could face whatever came. The aliens who watched from above grew unsettled. They had expected humans to fail, to collapse in fear when the storm struck. Instead, they saw humans grow stronger. They saw the colony not only survive but rise with greater unity. The aliens spoke in their halls, some with disbelief, others with quiet worry. For they understood something important. Fire was not just heat. It was a symbol. And when humans embraced symbols, they often became unstoppable. Back in the colony, the people began to experiment further. They placed stones near the flames, watching them change with the heat. Some cracked and broke, others glowed faintly before cooling. They used fire to harden tools, making them stronger and sharper. They even discovered that smoke from fire could drive away insects and strange creatures that wandered too close. Each new discovery deepened their trust in the flame. But perhaps the greatest change was not in their tools, or even in their survival. It was in their spirit. Before, the people had endured because they had no choice. They lived from day to day, carrying the weight of survival like a burden. Now, they began to live with purpose. They spoke of what could be built, what could be made, what the future might hold. Fire had awakened something inside them that had slept for too long. At night, the colony gathered around the largest fire. The flames rose high, their light touching every face. Elders told stories of Earth, of the sun that once warmed oceans and lands filled with green. For the first time, the children could imagine it, for they now knew what true warmth felt like. They could picture waves moving under sunlight, forests alive with life, skies filled with brightness. The stories were no longer only dreams. They were echoes of something real, something the people now carried in their own hands. The elder woman who had once defended the flame spoke again during one of these gatherings. She told the people that they had reached a turning point. Before fire, they had lived in fear of the cold, surviving but never thriving. With fire, they had taken control of their fate. The world was still harsh, storms would still come, but they no longer walked in weakness. They walked with light. Her words sank deep into every heart. The colony understood that they had crossed a boundary. They were no longer the same people who had stepped onto this frozen world years ago. They were changing, and the change could not be undone. Even the children sensed it. They looked at the fire not as something borrowed but as something theirs. They carried small torches when they walked between shelters, their faces proud as if holding banners of victory. They spoke of building larger fires, of lighting the frozen plains, of turning the endless night into a land of light. The cold still pressed against the colony each day, but it was no longer a master. It had become a challenge, and the people welcomed it. Fire had given them not only warmth, but the will to fight, the courage to dream, and the hope to rise. The aliens who continued to watch grew quiet. Some still mocked, calling the humans reckless. But others felt a deep unease. They knew that history often turned on such moments. A people who discovered fire did not remain the same. They grew. They changed. They reached for more. And so the colony stood at its turning point. Their first battle with fire had been won. The fear that once bound them had been transformed into strength. What lay ahead was uncertain, but they no longer walked in darkness alone. They carried sparks in their hands, and with those sparks they would shape their future. The endless night still ruled the land, but the people no longer bowed before it. They had fire, and with it, they had begun to rise. The fire had become the heart of the colony. Every path led to it, every story circled around it, and every person carried its warmth in their memory. The people no longer spoke of fire as a discovery but as a companion. It was with them in every storm, in every meal, and in every moment of rest. Yet with each day, they learned something new. Fire was not only a tool. It was a teacher. The first lesson was respect. The people had seen what fire could do if left wild. They remembered the cloth that had burned in moments, the sparks carried away by the wind, the fear that followed. Because of this, they treated the flame with care. They built stronger fire pits lined with heavy stones. They created rules for every family. No child could touch the fire without an elder's watchful eye. No worker could leave a flame without a guard. The fire was precious, but it demanded discipline. The second lesson was patience. The flame did not always obey. Sometimes sparks refused to catch, even after hours of striking stone. Sometimes wood smoldered without rising into flame. The people learned not to rush. They learned to feed fire gently, to wait for it to grow, to give it what it needed rather than force it. This patience spread into other parts of their lives. When crops grew slowly, when storms lasted longer than expected, they remembered the patience of fire. The third lesson was change. Fire transformed everything it touched. It turned ice to water, raw food to meals, weak tools into hardened ones. The people marveled at how simple stones, when heated, cracked into shapes that could be used. They learned that clay hardened near the flame, becoming strong enough to hold water. They built their first clay jars, smooth and sturdy, carried proudly as proof of their growing knowledge. The people gathered often to share what they had learned. Around the largest fire, workers displayed new tools, hunters spoke of food cooked in new ways, and children showed small lamps they had crafted with clay and cloth. The colony became a place of invention, each person adding to the lessons of flame. The aliens who watched from their ships took notice. They recorded how humans now worked late into the night by firelight, how their shelters grew stronger, how their tools improved. To the aliens, this was both familiar and unsettling. They remembered their own histories, the times when their ancestors first learned the same lessons. Fire had always been more than survival. It was the beginning of progress. To see humans now standing on this path made the watchers uneasy. The fourth lesson of fire was unity. The people no longer hid in separate shelters during storms. They gathered together around large fires, their voices joined in songs and stories. The flames lit their faces, reminding them they were not alone. Children played safely within circles of warmth, while elders spoke of courage and endurance. Fire gave them a center, a place where all could belong. One evening, the elder woman who had guided the colony since the first spark rose to speak. The fire glowed beside her, and the people listened in silence. She said that fire was more than light and heat. It was a reminder of who they were. Humans had always been seekers, she said. They had always looked into the dark and dared to bring light. Fire was not only a gift of survival. It was proof of their spirit. Her words sank deep into the hearts of the people. They began to see fire not just as a force of nature but as part of themselves. When they carried flames in their hands, they felt as though they carried their own courage, their own strength. Each spark became a symbol of what it meant to be human. The fifth lesson of fire was memory. The people understood now that fire must never be forgotten. They kept sparks alive in every shelter, small and carefully guarded, so that the colony would never again face the cold without it. Children were taught to strike stones as soon as they could hold them, so the knowledge would pass to every generation. Fire became more than a tool of the present. It became a bond to the future. With each lesson, the colony changed. Walls grew taller, food tasted richer, lives grew longer. But most important was the change inside their hearts. They no longer walked in weakness. They walked with fire. The aliens who watched began to argue among themselves. Some said humans were still fragile and foolish, that they would destroy themselves with their reckless use of flame. But others disagreed. They saw the unity of the colony, the pride in the children, the strength in the workers' hands. They saw a people who grew stronger not in spite of their weakness, but because of it. Fire had given them not just survival but identity. Back in the colony, the people continued to learn. They experimented with new fuels, feeding fire with different woods and fibers, watching how the flames changed color and strength. They learned that smoke could signal across great distances, allowing them to speak to one another even through storms. They learned that ash from fire could help crops grow better in their small domes. Every lesson brought them closer to a life that was not just survival, but growth. The sixth lesson of fire was hope. Before, the people had lived with their heads bowed, each day a burden, each storm a trial. Now, when they looked into the flames, they saw more than warmth. They saw possibility. They spoke of new shelters, larger and stronger. They dreamed of exploring farther across the frozen plains, carrying fire with them to light the way. For the first time, the future did not seem empty. It seemed full of sparks waiting to be found. The endless night still stretched across the land. The storm still howled, the cold still pressed, the sky still held no sun. But the people no longer saw only darkness. They saw fire glowing in their hands, and in that glow, they saw their own reflection. The colony had learned the lessons of flame. And though they did not yet know it, these lessons would carry them far beyond their frozen world. Fire was not just survival. Fire was the beginning of their rise. The colony no longer lived as strangers in the frozen world. They walked with steady steps, their faces warmed by the glow of firelight. The once silent nights now echoed with voices, with laughter, with the rhythm of hammers shaping new tools. The flames had become more than a source of survival. They had become the center of life. When travelers from nearby shelters visited, they were welcomed with warmth they had never known. At first, they were afraid of the flames, standing at a distance as if the fire were alive and dangerous. But when they felt the heat on their skin, when they saw food cooked with new taste and smelled the smoke that rose like a living spirit into the sky, they began to understand. Slowly, they too joined the circle, and their fear melted away. The people of the colony taught them what they had learned. They showed them how to strike sparks from stone, how to feed the flame with care, how to carry it in small clay jars so it would never be lost. Each visitor left with fire in their hands, carrying it back to their own families, their own homes. What had begun as a single spark deep beneath the earth now spread across the land, carried from one heart to another. The aliens who had watched from the sky could not look away. They had seen other species rise, stumble, and fall, but the humans were different. They did not accept their limits. They did not bow to the darkness. Instead, they turned weakness into strength, fear into courage, and danger into hope. This ability unsettled the aliens. They whispered among themselves that if fire spread too far, humans might one day grow beyond even their control. In the colony, the people did not think of control or power. They thought only of life. Fire made them dream, and with dreams came plans. They built stronger shelters with stones baked hard by flame. They crafted tools sharper than any they had used before. They even began to make new clothes, sewing fibers treated in smoke so they would last longer against the cold. Every part of life grew brighter with the lessons of fire. The children of the colony became its greatest messengers. They carried torches when they played in the fields of ice, their voices rising like songs against the night. They no longer feared the shadows. They chased them with laughter, knowing the fire would always follow. These children would grow up never remembering the hopeless silence of the years before the spark. To them, fire had always been part of life, as natural as breath. The elders saw this change with pride. They knew that the colony had reached more than survival. It had reached the beginning of a future. They spoke often by the fire, telling the young ones that every spark carried a story. To lose fire would be to forget who they were. But to keep it alive would mean carrying humanity itself forward into whatever lay ahead. As months passed, more visitors came from far across the frozen plains. Each group carried stories of struggle, of hunger, of storms that had nearly broken them. And each time, the colony welcomed them, gave them warmth, shared their food, and placed fire into their hands. The visitors left with sparks burning in clay jars, their eyes bright with new strength. Fire was no longer bound to one colony. It was spreading like a chain of light across the endless night. The aliens who watched grew divided. Some argued that fire would bring ruin, that humans were reckless and would destroy themselves before they could rise. Others, however, began to admire the humans. They saw how fire gave them unity, how it turned small, fragile groups into communities filled with strength. They began to wonder if perhaps this was what made humans different, the power to turn even the smallest discovery into something greater than themselves. The colony continued to grow. They built large beacons at the edges of their settlement, flames rising into the sky like stars born from the ground. From far away, travelers could see them shining, guiding them to safety. The frozen world that had once been nothing but endless dark now glittered with points of light. Each flame was a declaration that humanity was alive and would not be silenced. One evening, as the people gathered around the central fire, the elder woman rose to speak once more. The flames danced against her face, and the people listened with quiet hearts. She told them that fire was more than survival, more than warmth, more than even hope. Fire was a promise. It was the promise that no matter how deep the night became, there would always be light. It was the promise that humans would not vanish into silence but would rise, again and again, no matter the cost. Her words stirred something powerful in every listener. They looked into the flames and saw not just themselves, but their children, their children's children, and generations yet unborn. They saw cities rising from ice, ships crossing the stars, and fires burning on worlds far beyond their frozen home. They saw a future lit not by one flame, but by countless sparks spreading across the darkness of the universe. The aliens who listened from afar were silent that night. For in the glow of that single fire, they saw the beginning of a story they knew too well. It was the story of rising, of reaching, of never stopping. Humanity had lit its first flame, and there would be no turning back. From that day, the people no longer thought of themselves as broken survivors in a hostile land. They thought of themselves as keepers of the spark. Each person carried it with pride, not just in their hands but in their hearts. Every flame was part of a chain that stretched into the future. Every spark was a promise that humanity would endure. The endless night still lay heavy on the world. Storms would still come, the cold would still bite, and the stars would still hang far above in silence. But the people no longer feared them. They had fire. And fire had given them more than survival. It had given them identity, unity, and a future. The first battle with fire had been won. The sparks now spread across the land, across the stars, and perhaps, one day, across the entire universe. The humans were ready. And the darkness would never again be the same.